If you count the legal votes, I easily win. Those words from President Donald Trump during a 16-minute rambling address delivered in the White House press briefing room. He walked away without answering any questions. His first public appearance since declaring on election night that he had won the presidency. Addressing media, Donald Trump said there had been a lot of shenanigans and the country couldn't stand for that.
If you count the legal votes, I easily win. If you count the illegal votes, they can try to steal the election from us. If you count the votes that came in late, we're looking at them very strongly, but a lot of votes came in late. We think there's going to be a lot of litigation because we have so much evidence, so much proof, and it's going to end up perhaps at the highest court in the land. We'll see. But we think there'll be a lot of litigation because we can't have an election stolen like this. We're hearing stories that are horror stories, absolute horror stories, and we can't let that happen to the United States of America. It's not a question of who wins, Republican, Democrat, Joe, myself. We can't let that happen to our country. We can't be disgraced by having something like this happen. But ultimately, I have a feeling judges are going to have to rule. But there's been a lot of shenanigans, and we can't stand for that in our country. Thank you very much.
The Trump camp has already launched several legal bids to challenge or stop the vote count in critical swing states, as Joe Biden increasingly appears to have an easier path to the Oval Office. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona and Nevada are all potentially lining up as the legal battlegrounds. So is there any evidence of voter fraud or a case for the courts to wade in? Professor Kermit Roosevelt from Pennsylvania University is an expert in constitutional law. We spoke via Skype a little earlier. Now, if you are watching us as well as listening, the busy prof is also pulling dad duties, so excuse the occasional interruption. I asked Professor Roosevelt what he thinks of Donald Trump's corruption claims.
That's a sad day for American democracy when the leader of our political system is really attacking the system itself. And it's what we've come to expect from Donald Trump. He doesn't really play by the rules. He doesn't seem to respect the idea of American self-governance. But it's disturbing to see how willing he is to call into question the legitimacy of the system or really set aside the system if there's any element of it that's not working to his favor.
So, given he's made these claims, what evidence or basis is there for his claims and for any subsequent legal challenges?
Well, so far, he's made some very broad and vague claims about fraud, and there's really no evidence for that. He hasn't specified what he's talking about. There are particular issues with ballots received after Election Day in Pennsylvania. So the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said that under state law, you could count ballots that were received up to 3 days after Election Day. And that was necessary in part because the Trump administration reduced the ability of the U.S. Postal Service to deliver ballots in a timely fashion. So there's some room for Trump to challenge some ballots. But it doesn't look to me as though they have any legal argument that could affect enough ballots to change the outcome of the election.
In terms of the postal ballots, given that Donald Trump actively encouraged his supporters to not use postal ballots, if at all possible, are we to believe that he was setting himself up to exercise this legal option if he needed to?
Well, it's an interesting question because, a lot of things that Donald Trump does, it seems like they don't make sense. And then maybe it seems like it was part of a very clever strategy because he has done that. If you're going to challenge an election after the fact and you're going to try to change the result by disqualifying ballots, you have to make sure that you're disqualifying your opponent's ballots and not yours. And he really did do that. He set up a situation where the ballots that were cast by mail are very heavily the Biden ballots. So if he can go after those and try to delegitimize those or ultimately get a court to throw them out, then it's going to help him.
Is it the categorical right of the state court to decide how long those mail-in ballots can be counted for, or is it a live and contestable issue for a higher court?
It's a contestable issue because the US Constitution says that the state legislature is in charge of determining the rules for elections. And there's a question how much a state court can change those rules based on the state constitution or based on its own authority. So there is a sort of a foothold for a federal court to come in and upset what the state courts have done. It would be very unusual. And particularly in a situation where the election has taken place and people have acted in reliance on what state courts have said and cast ballots in ways that they had every reason to expect would be legal. It would be very unusual for a federal court to set those aside now.
Okay, so for us in New Zealand, we would hark back. What we remember so distinctly is Bush versus Gore over Florida, the battle, that battle in 2000. What would it take for a court to get involved at that level?
Well, you could have a recount, which is really what was going on in Bush v. Gore, and then you could have a dispute about how the recount was conducted. But the thing about that is that in Bush v. Gore, it came down to several hundred votes in one state. And a recount can certainly shift votes by 100 or 200 or 300. But at this point, it doesn't look like there are states that are close enough and necessary for a Biden victory where a recount could do that. So Trump has asked for a recount in Wisconsin. A margin of 20,000 votes, a recount is probably not going to change that. So really, if he's going to prevail in the courts, he needs a pretty ambitious theory about invalidating mail-in ballots. And so far, he hasn't come up with that.
So what are the rules around automatic recounts? And does each state march to the beat of its own drum?
That's up to the states. Typically, they'll say that if the result is within 1%, you can get a recount. But, given the very large number of ballots that have been cast, that's a very large number of ballots. So everyone seems to agree that we're not within the Bush v. Gore territory yet.
Is this unprecedented? You don't even have a result yet, and the incumbent has fired up a number of legal challenges.
Well, what's unprecedented, I think, is first sort of the tenor of the criticism and the extent to which the Trump team is alleging fraud and theft and casting doubt on the election, and also the extent to which they were doing that even before the election occurred, because this does seem to be a strategy that they had planned out in advance, where one of the things that happened when Trump suggested that his supporters go to the polls in person rather than using mail-in votes was that their votes would be counted earlier. So you would get the impression early on Election Day that Trump was ahead. And his plan, which they basically came out and announced, was to say, I'm winning, stop the counting, the election is over. And Fox News actually interfered with that plan by calling Arizona for Joe Biden, making it harder for Trump to claim victory. But it seems like that's what they're trying to do still.
So can you put it in perspective for us here in New Zealand? I mean, this kind of legal action, how costly is it?
Well, it's costly to democracy, really, and that's what we should be thinking about. The campaigns have plenty of money. I don't think that they're worried about that. And, the Trump administration has been asking for donations to fund litigation into December. But the real loser here is the American system of self-governance, where an election that should be decided by the people is being thrown into the courts, and the American people more broadly, because this attack on our system is really going to make people question the legitimacy of our whole constitutional system.
So what does it mean for the timeline of things? Because the Electoral College meets on what date, and what happens if all of these legal cases are still going on?
Well, the electoral votes are going to be counted on December 14th. And it seems unlikely to me, I've said first, the states should be finished with their counting within a couple of days. There is going to be a recount in Wisconsin. Apparently, there might be more, but those shouldn't extend the timeline that much. It's possible that litigation could, but again, I don't yet see a legal theory that's going to make a difference. So the Trump campaign is throwing a lot of things out there, but it seems like it's more of a public relations campaign than a litigation strategy.
So if we assume for the moment that Joe Biden wins the necessary number of Electoral College votes to be president, does the inauguration go ahead regardless of whether there is any live legal action?
Well, if the Senate If the president of the Senate opens the votes from the electors and certifies that Joe Biden has won, then yes. Whether or not there's litigation might affect whether he does that. I mean, of course, it's Mike Pence, so you would expect that he'll have some loyalty to Trump. But it doesn't seem very likely to me that there's going to be a legal case and a legal theory that would actually affect the outcome. So it looks to me as though Biden is going to win Pennsylvania. It looks to me as though Biden is going to have a margin that Trump is not going to be able to affect.
The other issue that some people might raise is if some element of legal challenge was to make it to the Supreme Court, obviously, arguably, that is potentially favouring Donald Trump in terms of the makeup of that court. Would you have any concerns about that?
Well, I'm certainly concerned about the appearance of it. And that's another thing that Trump has made worse by his public comments, because he's talked about needing to have 9 justices on the court to resolve election-related disputes. He's made it sound as though those are his justices and he expects them to rule for him. So, generally speaking, we don't want the courts deciding elections. And that happened in Bush v. Gore. It was bad for the court. I think it was bad for the country. And we all hope that it won't happen again.
So in your professional opinion, looking at the grounds that Donald Trump is advancing these legal challenges, do you think he has no chance?
I think his chances are very small. He's had Republican judges rule against him. He's had Trump-appointed judges rule against him. I don't think that what he has so far will get him anywhere.
It's been lovely to talk to you. For our audience, would you like to introduce your junior who's been popping into picture every now and again?
Come here for a second. They want to say hi. Yes, that was unexpected.
So this is
always welcome. This is my son, Marin.
So the great grandson
yes,
of President Ted Roosevelt.
That is him.
Hi, it's lovely to meet you. Thank you for joining us for the interview.
I can't hear you.
That's okay.
Oh.
Thank you very much for your time. Much appreciated. Good to see you both. Okay, so that was Professor Kermit Roosevelt from Pennsylvania University, with his son making an occasional appearance, and the cat was getting in on it as well.